The end of the 19th century saw the release of an iconic horror property that sucks. Literally. That's right, Bram Stoker's Dracula. But long before Francis Ford Coppola took a crack at the film, about a million other people also tried to capitalize on Stoker's macabre tale of vampires and real estate agents. But who cashed in on Stoker's success first, you might ask? That's right. Hello and welcome back to the program. I am once again your host Joe, and today we're going to talk about the granddaddy of all vampire films, Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. Or as my fellow millennials might know it better,
Nosferatu!
The 1922 film Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror is widely considered to be the first vampire film ever made, and while that's technically not correct, there aren't any surviving prints of either of the earlier films that deal with vampires. So if you want the earliest you can get, this is it. Technically, we shouldn't even have this film. The Stoker estate ordered all copies of the film destroyed as part of their lawsuit that also destroyed the production company, Prana Films. Even with the tweaks that the film's screenwriter, Henrique Guélin, made to the story, it was still very obviously Dracula, and the derivative nature of the film was easy to prove in court. It's worth mentioning that Prana Films was set to make a whole host of occult-themed films before the lawsuit shut them down. And one can only imagine what they might have done with a German version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Maybe Dr. Yannick and Mr. Heideberger? Luckily, despite the court's order to destroy the film, they did miss a few copies. Prints had already been sent overseas for viewing, so this masterpiece of German Expressionism survives to this day. German Expressionism was shaped and influenced by the dread of the First World War, with settings and aesthetic exaggerated to enhance the role that perspective played. For obvious reasons, it didn't exactly leave the country's borders. After all, the Germans were saddled with the blame for the First World War, and the people were kind of stuck in place, what with the huge economic downturn. Expressionist art in general is meant to show subjects not from a realistic and objective position, rooted in reality, but instead are meant to show a perspective, and the tone and the moods that come with that perspective. The raw terror of the scream, the sadness of the old guitarist, the mourning of dead child. With the widespread use of photography, art no longer needed to convey things in a realistic manner, and could instead start to experiment with tone and emotion visually as a metaphor. But we aren't here for a lesson on German Expressionism, we're here to talk about movies. As stated before, Nosferatu is more or less a hot take on the Dracula property, which is why Bram Stoker's estate was able to successfully sue the company. The vampire was rewritten to be a reclusive Transylvanian count named Orlok, and the Harkers were rewritten to be a new couple, the Hutters. See, it's nothing like it. I'm not sure why the lawsuit against Nosferatu was successful. These are clearly original characters. Much like the original film, the original score was also destroyed. However, unlike the film, there were no surviving copies of the music. As a result, if you, like me, purchased a copy of Nosferatu on DVD from a Blockbuster bargain bin, you may have been subjected to some scene shocks like this. There are versions of the film with attempts at recreating the original score. Some notes did survive. There are also some attempts at just making a whole new score to go with it. And you can watch either of these attempts on YouTube in their entirety. The film has entered into public domain by now. I mean, it makes sense. It's almost 100 years old. I think it'll be 100 years next year, in fact. However, I've found these musics somewhat lacking. The non-dramatic parts have dramatic sound, the dramatic parts sometimes don't. It's a little bit of a mess, and that's a risk you run with silent films. The idea of musical stings that timed with the action of a film were probably not wholly alien at the time. They may have been considered a somewhat fresh development for film, but stage plays have used sound effects in their productions for centuries. They pioneered the art of Foley, after all. So, obviously, the notion of that wasn't something that they couldn't have come up with. In fact, I watched earlier today Faust, another of F.W. Murnau's silent era films, and sure enough, the music in that punctuated the scenes beautifully. I don't know what's going on with the attempts on this, but it doesn't quite work. In any event, the recreations or the new scores are a lot better than some alternatives. Regardless of the dubious originality of the film, the execution of the film was done beautifully. The transformation of actor Max Schreck into the horrifying Count Orlok is a sight to behold, and the effects they employed feel very advanced for their time. That they were able to achieve all of these practical effects in camera is especially impressive. The tricks of lighting, the unnatural movements. I know that in Bram Stoker's Dracula 70 years later, Francis Ford Coppola tried to do as many in-camera effects as he could. And I can't help but think that he was maybe a little inspired by this film and the inventive measures they took. These days, you can just CGI half this stuff. They actually had to build practical sets. They had to set up, wooden props to make things happen. Technical film, actual practical effects in a film will always impress me. Big-name movie critic Roger Ebert said of the film, "Here's the story of Dracula. Before it was buried alive in cliches, jokes, TV skits, cartoons, and more than 30 other films. The film is in awe of its material. It seems to really believe in vampires." One of the producers of Nosferatu, Albin Grau, said that he was inspired to shoot this film by an experience he'd had during the First World War, in which a Serbian farmer told him that his father was a vampire and also undead. Albin Grau was also, curiously enough, a friend and colleague of one Aleister Crowley, and a member in good standing of the Fraternitas Saturni, a mystical order with ties to Crowley's School of Hermetics. The Fraternitas Saturni still exists today, in fact, though it was briefly outlawed in the 30s and 40s. I'm sure you can imagine why. Also worth noting, the current Grand Master of the Fraternitas is named Thought. Am I saying that Grau maybe actually believed that vampires existed and injected that into the film? I don't know, maybe. The consequence is, however, that this film feels gritty and real in a way that some later vampire films just didn't. Orlok felt like a tangible creature, whereas Dracula just feels... A lot of the time Dracula feels like he's too good. He's too good at what he's doing. Dracula is the monster Mary Sue. It's also worth noting that Grau was responsible for a lot of the film's look and the prop design. He snuck mystical symbols into the film where he could, and if you take a close look at the real estate contract Knox sends Thomas Hutter off to Transylvania with, it's littered with such symbols. He's very into his own thing, and he will not be stopped from being self-referential. There's a film based in part on Nosferatu from 2000, Shadow of the Vampire. It was produced by none other than Nicolas Cage, who might just be the closest thing the modern era has to someone using the expressionist style, and it explores the concept of shooting the film with a real vampire. However, the film makes the choice to have the director, F.W. Murnau, be the true believer, who's recruited the night creature to play in his film, and Albin is, he's a producer. He drinks on the set, and he believes Max Schreck to be just another actor, albeit a brilliant and convincing method actor. All of the major players are there, in fact. Albin Grau is the head producer, the director, F.W. Murnau, the writer, Heinrich Galeen, and of course the cinematographer/camera operator, Fritz Wagner. Willem Dafoe, of course, does a fantastic job portraying Max Schreck. I have to use quotation marks here, as the identity of the vampire is never really made clear. The writer penned the name Orlok, and Murnau came up with the name Schreck. So it's my belief that the vampire in question simply doesn't remember his own identity. He exists as a creature, though terrifyingly thinking, and ultimately that's what makes him a great monster. The best monsters are things that are like us, but different in a fundamental and shocking way. The vampire is a being who's been alive for so long that he doesn't remember how he even became what he is. He tells us in one scene that he remembers the vampire that made him, a woman, but he doesn't remember what she looks like. He had a painting, but it's long gone by now, and the image of the painting in his mind is also gone. All he remembers now is that he remembered. He doesn't remember what he remembered, he just knows that at one point, he knew. The slow decay of a human into a beast of base desires is what the vampire is painted as here, and I kinda love that. He tells us he read Dracula. It made him sad. He tells us that Dracula was able to get his castle in order for a visitor easily. He points out that after a few hundred years living alone, would he even know how to buy bread or set a table? I mean, they say you never forget how to ride a bike, but let's be real, they aren't talking about a time frame of a few hundred years here. If you don't ride a bike for 200 years, you're probably not going to remember. The film also takes some liberties with the real lives of the filmmakers in question. I mean, of the bunch, most of them die. Murnau is the only one left standing at the end. That's actually a little ironic, considering Murnau was the first of the major players in the film's production to have actually died, as a result of a car accident in 1931. So what do we owe to this film in the end? Well, there's a whole concept of what the vampire is that was derived from this piece. Death from the sun was established in Nosferatu, whereas previously the sun merely made a vampire uncomfortable. The eerie movements of Count Orlok cannot be understated as an influence on future creatures, and while the character of Dracula and his cousin Blackula are frequently depicted as a more suave and stylish type of vampire, there's always room for more primal beast-like takes on the creature, be they straight-up remakes of Count Orlok himself, or the more animalistic vampires of, say, 2011's action schlock Priest. The idea of vampires descending into a more bestial form the longer it lives is one that's always going to be worth exploring, in my opinion. Nosferatu is a film with haunting visuals and, admittedly, unoriginal story. I definitely recommend giving it a watch. If you can deal with silent films, you will not regret it one bit. It's still relevant to this day for a very good reason. Do yourself a favor, search it on YouTube. It's public domain, it is there. Thank you for tuning in. I have once again been your host, Joe. I've once again been your ghost, Joe. It's October still. Tune in next week. I don't know what we're doing for November, but I'm sure it'll be something amusing.
Your Honor, you take away our right to steal ideas? Where are they gonna come from? Her?